Ahoy! Today we're talking about my experience with the mid-season PTS. There were a lot of very interesting changes, some good, some a bit over the top in my opinion, that I felt like talking about and giving you a bit more insight into what I experienced. As always, keep in mind that these games were played on very high ping, somewhere between 230, 240 to almost 300. So obviously I couldn't get a full picture of how everything will feel on the live client because abilities and basic attacks are simply a lot harder to hit. Also, since public test server games include all levels of play, you often get relatively unfair teams. But that aside, I could still get a decent idea of at least some things. I begin with some of the things that really stood out to me about the map changes and some of the most drastic item changes or god changes that had the most significant impact, and then we'll look at the different roles specifically. Let's begin with the map changes. We have the new green buff now, which is for supports, provides you with extra health and later on with some HP5 and MP5 as well when it's enhanced, and it also freezes the buff timer for your ally. I personally really like this buff. I think it offers something new and unique for supports that can be utilized for the allies as well, so it's not purely for the support, but also allows them to withstand early aggression a little bit better. What we saw in most games was that at the start of the game the support would actually end up soloing this buff, either with the help of Hog or without it, and then rotate to the purple buff along with the carry. This obviously makes the purple buff clear a little bit slower, but it seems like an easy way to get that early extra XP and gold. Another more advanced option is what you saw in the gameplay in the background, which is what Okeanos suggested to me because Kalas had tried this successfully, which was starting the green buff and clearing that with abilities and basic attacks, and then using Hand of the Gods on the 3 back harpies on that side, which are now all small harpies, for some very quick extra XP and gold. If either of those will become meta, I can't say yet, but it feels very natural for the support to start on the green buff at least. There are 2 issues with this buff though. The first one being that this buff is so far away from anywhere where a support would normally be. It is not close to duo lane, it is not close to mid lane, it is all the way back. And that leads to a situation where as a jungler, you're not really sure if you're supposed to clear it or not. Obviously you want to clear it for the extra XP and gold and because you can clear it quicker than the support, but you don't know if your support will be able to rotate over in time. Sometimes the timing just happens to add up and it works out well, but that's not always the case. At the same time, you can also solo clear it as the support, but that takes a fair bit longer and also requires you to go back there. Normally buffs in SMITE are adjacent to the lane where the character is playing, which is why the speed buff can be further back because the jungler doesn't have a lane where he has to be, but all other buffs are relatively close and easy to pick up, and that is simply not the case for the green buff. It's obviously very frustrating for the support to miss out on a dropped buff because they're maybe busy clearing a lane on the middle of a fight or something. My suggestion to remove some frustration from that would be to increase the pickup time, in other words the time that the green buff is on the ground. Normally for each buff I think that is 30 seconds and I think this could be doubled for the green buff, so that the support will have plenty of time to walk back there between waves as long as they're paying attention and the jungler pings it out. It only seems fair that when you have a longer travel path you also get more time to get there, especially since it wouldn't make any difference if the support ends up clearing the buff themselves. The second issue with the green buff is, well, that it's green. And that means the minimap icon is green, and the icon for a drop buff is a small green dot on the map next to the buff camp where you drop it. And this is something that is perfectly visible with every other buff because they are not green. But when it's a green dot next to a green buff, it suddenly becomes a fair bit harder to see. So that can be a little bit annoying, and I imagine this could be especially frustrating for people with any kind of color blindness. But that's not the only camp that was changed. As I said, the back harpies on that side are now 3 small harpies, so that makes a little bit of a difference, make them very easy to clear, some quick golden XP. But you also have the 2 alpha harpies towards the duo side with slightly changed stats. These felt relatively hard to clear most of the time, and I would say too early in the game you at least don't want to clear them solo, but that's always been the case with that harpy even when it was still 1. On the solo side on the other hand, you have that singular big harpy, which feels significantly easier to clear, especially when you're playing Bakasura because you can instantly eat it. This also gives solo laners quite a few things to do, which means high pressure solo laners seem to be favorable in many ways. Basic attacking ones or ability based ones, but if you have low pressure, there's another objective now that you can't contest outside of the Scorpion as well as the Totem, and at some point I feel like you just gotta focus on the more aggressive solos in order to not fall behind too much with all the extra farm you're missing. The new objective on the duo side, the Draugr, is interesting. I haven't really seen too much use of its passive effect yet. Usually it was just cleared in the middle of the game without any particular timing for a better defense or something. But he is relatively easy to clear even early in the game and can give your team a nice little boost. So that is something to be aware of, that you can definitely clear him with your support and carry at various stages of the game as well. In terms of items, there are a few that stood out to me which would apply in and outside of Conquest as well. The first one is Staff of Myrddin. This got buffed with having 80% cooldown reduction after using your ultimate, and then the cooldown reduction slowly scales down, and on certain characters this felt absolutely overwhelming. I know there are a lot of clips going around from PTS where people combined this with Bomber's Hammer and then got ridiculous cooldown reduction. Gotta say, in most games you won't be able to easily apply that reduction consistently because enemies are typically moving and mage basic attacks are relatively slow, and you also get punished for just standing around and basic attacking. But that said, there are still certain niche cases at least where this item felt very broken, where you can extend certain effects for very, very long. I don't want to get into too much detail here because first of all I want to see if this item gets nerfed, because if it doesn't, then I most certainly don't want to disclose which cards completely break this, because it's going to be unfun for everyone if everyone uses this. Sunder, or Sundering Spear, was also an extremely present item on PTS that I saw built pretty much every game. While the item was changed, it wasn't inherently nerfed and allows you to deal a lot of damage, especially to a high health target or a full health target with the true projectiles. They have separate cooldowns, which means the total cooldown can be quite long if you use both, but still having that extra burst option and the damage amplification can be very, very useful. Now, I don't know how much this was just people wanting to test out the changed version, but I do think that in its current state, Sunder is probably still a fair bit too strong, and it might need some more nerfs in order for it to not be a every game pickup. This is especially true in builds where you can build this in combination with Relic Dagger, which makes it a lot more usable frequently in fights. On the other hand, as an anti-shield tool, I would say it was nerfed a fair bit, because you have to commit a lot in order to remove an enemy's shield entirely. You can reduce it down to 50% or later when it's upgraded to 75%, but if you want to zero it, then you're really committing a ton to a single target in terms of cooldown, in terms of relic cooldown. And one other item that I think is worth pointing out is Transcendence. It felt like it could be a very clear and easy choice for a lot of guards, because it's great for both hunters as well as junglers now. There's not really much of a downside in building it, since you don't really need boots, so you can just stack it relatively early and you will have the full stacks very early. It's also otherwise a nice item in terms of early stats to have. Considering it builds nicely into other items now and it is cheaper now, I really see no reason not to build it on most physical damage oriented characters, and that may be a bit of a problem. Overall, I like the new map layout. I think it spices things up and gives especially junglers more flexibility as well, because for example solo can be more rewarding to attempt to gank, because even if the gank doesn't work out, you might get some harpies or something just to get a little bit of farm here and there. And through that, carries and solo laners obviously also get more flexibility in how exactly they want to play their lane. It does, however, make me think that most roles will prefer a larger quantity of aggressive picks, just because those should be more able to clear all these jungle objectives, whereas more passive picks that can't really solo clear objectives or camps until later might fall behind a little bit. The boots removal as the biggest change generally feels very good to me, and I enjoyed it. I will say though that it feels like there's a little bit of a lack of bridging items at the moment, because there's not really many mid-price items that you can buy. Some roles have access to a few, but with the most tier 2 items, or like items that finish as tier 2s being removed from the game, there isn't really that much around the 1,500 gold mark that you can aim to do so. A lot of power spikes will be happening a fair bit later, but then also be heavier in return. To also talk a little bit about the specific roles, for junglers, I already pointed out that I think Transcendence will be relatively strong. And I also think that on the gods that have cleaves, Mannequin Scepter is very, very strong now. I've shown that with Kali and with Nike, the difference in my latest gameplays. With Nike, it felt so much stronger because you get so much sustain and so much quick clear. So if your god has cleaves, then this might be a very good choice now. And it also scales with Transcendence, so it can be ran even better than I did in that game. Another item that I think is worth keeping in mind is Berserker's Shield, which got pretty significant buffs and might be a nicer flex option for a lot of basic attack focused jungles now. When it comes to Hunters, I didn't have too much of a chance to play them, but what I do think is potentially going to happen is that we might see some relatively early crit builds. Obviously, likely the most common build will just be a Transcendence into RC and then the usual route, but I could imagine that some people will branch out from that and just say, okay, I might go Devils again and just get crit really, really early into the game. This is just speculation though. Likewise, Atalantas might make a bit of a return because it's pretty stat efficient now. Mage carries also get some interesting options with the rings having early attack speed now, so there's some potential in that, especially since you don't need boots for early attack speed spikes that might work well for gods like Freya, for example. When it comes to mid lane mages, Staff of Myrddin I already mentioned. Aside of that, Vampiric Shroud and Bloodsoaked Shroud also seem very interesting. Vampiric Shroud really makes you quite beefy in early game now, and that is something that I think shouldn't be undervalued, and this could also be used in solo lane. Solo lane generally, I think, will see a lot of different potential. While we still saw the Rangda's Mask start being used on PTS, there were a lot of experiments going on as well, because there are more attack speed options, with Berserker's Shield and Shogun's Kusari being buffed. There's also Death Toll, which might work better on cleave guards, and then Bluestone Pendant's secondary upgrade is now also a lot more interesting because you can actually stack it much easier on the same target with multiple abilities, meaning you can get a lot of attack speed out of in late game, which means a guard that maybe works well with Bluestone in early but wants attack speed in late game can utilize this as well. The Mystical Mail change is, in my opinion, in many ways also a buff, and also the Tainted Steel buffs and upgrade buffs might be very interesting if you ever run into a healing matchup. I tried Warflag a little bit in support, but so far at least I wasn't super impressed with it, especially because it doesn't work as they originally said. It doesn't tick multiple times on dots, which would have been horrible balance anyways. And the other starters haven't changed so significantly that you'd really have to reconsider all your options. What you might have to keep in mind is that you want to have some early extra protections on some guards in order to have sufficient protections to get the extra health from the green buff. Other than that, not needing boots obviously gives you more flexibility in other ways. You can, for example, go into early aggression through something like Stone of Binding, or you can just build your typical defensive choices earlier, like Thebes. So we'll see what happens in that regard, but I think overall support is probably one of the less affected role by these changes, though they may stay around dual lane longer. So overall I was quite happy with PTS, with a few concerns for specific items, but I imagine some of those might get nerfs anyways, and other than that, I'm really looking forward to being able to test this on the actual live client soon. If you want to see that and other upcoming SMITE videos, click like and subscribe, or I will come up with a new outro soon. For now, I thank my patrons for making this video possible. That's That Nick Walker, Dwayne Brennan, Lanta25 Green, Zelaria, Zed the Undead, Nevis Jr., Rawas, Angel, Eric's88, Z Feroli, and everyone else you see here.